If we move on then to step 3, where we are looking at the verbs and marks given to us in each of the requirements. Now, why is this important? Why are we looking at a step on verbs and marks? Well, what we're going to see is it's the verbs in the requirement that is the instruction the examiner has given us. We have to follow the instruction he gives us. And the marking allocation, of course, tells us how much we need to write for that requirement or how much depth we need to go into for that particular part. So if we have a look at our requirements again, what are the verbs? Looking at requirement A. Requirement A, we have to explain the term conflict of interest in the context of non-executive directors. So what does the verb explain mean? Explain means we have to make it clear to the examiner what this phrase means. The next thing we have to do is discuss the potential conflicts of interest relating to KK and Soria Supplies if John Soria were to become a NED of KK Limited. Now, I've just said that explain means we have to make clear what that phrase means. What does it mean if we have to discuss something? That's not quite the same thing. So if we're going to discuss the potential conflicts of interest in this scenario, then we need to examine, really, the potential conflicts of interests. So what are they? But that's not enough. Remember, discuss requires more depth than just identifying or stating what the conflicts of interest are. So in addition to establishing what the conflicts of interest are in the scenario, we're going to have to look at or examine what problems will they cause or might they cause. So, a bit of discussion around the issues raised by these conflicts of interest. Now, just to note then, in terms of the marking allocation, for Part A, there's 8 marks available in total, but there's 2 different parts to this requirement. So the examiner's given us 2 instructions. First, we have to explain the term conflict of interest, and then after that, we have to discuss the potential conflicts of interest in the scenario. So we need to divide out those 8 marks between our 2 separate instructions. Explaining the term conflict of interest is likely to get us 2 marks in the exam. You can expect, if you have to explain a particular word or phrase or give a definition in the exam, there's going to be 2 marks available for that, if you give a proper explanation. Which means there's 6 marks available for our second instruction for discussing the conflicts of interest in the scenario. Now, that's likely to be 2 marks per conflict. And I know that because if we're going to discuss the conflicts in the scenario, that requires a little bit of depth, which means we'll get 2 marks for discussing each individual conflict. So, we've looked at our verbs and marks for Part A. We quickly move on. What's happening in Part B? In Part B, we only have 1 instruction, where we've been asked to assess the advantages of appointing experienced and effective NEDs to the KK board during the period in which the company was growing rapidly. Now, the verb assess, the instruction there, is usually going to be to explain the strengths and weaknesses of a particular function, role, or idea, perhaps. However, in this question, the examiner has gone a step further and given us an even more specific instruction. So he wants us to assess the advantages of having NEDs on the board. So how would NEDs contribute to KK Limited in a positive way? Perhaps how would NEDs improve the current situation at KK Limited? Now follow the instruction given. We've been asked to assess the advantages. So at no point in our answer are we going to discuss or mention any of the potential disadvantages of having NEDs on the board. We're only looking at the advantages because that's what we've been told to do. 7 marks available in total. Again, if we're going to assess, this requires some level of depth. We're going to have to look at the scenario and understand and explain how NEDs will specifically help in the context of the scenario. So we will get 2 marks for each advantage that we assess adequately. Finally then, moving on to Part C. In Part C, we have that verb explain again, the typical contents of a best practice report, so we have to make it clear to the examiner what would be included in this report. And we also have to explain how its contents would help meet the needs of Finn Broun. So there's 2 instructions again in requirement C. If we have a look at the breakdown, there's actually quite a lot of marks available for just explaining the contents of our best practice report. We'll get up to 8 marks if we explain each section of the best practice report adequately, which means 2 marks for briefly commenting on the end as to how that report will assist Finn Broun.